The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of San Gabriel, a humble border town that had known peace since the end of the Civil War. Market stalls lined the main street, their colorful awnings fluttering in the gentle breeze as townsfolk went about their daily business. For Sheriff Elias Hardin, it was another quiet day on patrol, tipping his weathered hat to passing ladies and sharing brief nods with the shopkeepers. But peace, like most precious things, proved fragile. The first sign came with distant hoofbeats, growing louder until they thundered like war drums. Before Elias could sound the alarm, they appeared on the horizon, a column of riders, battle-hardened and grim-faced, their uniforms a patchwork of Confederate gray and stolen Union blue. At their head rode a man whose very presence seemed to darken the air around him, his scarred face set in cold determination. "Colonel Slade," Elias whispered, his blood running cold at the sight of the infamous Confederate officer who was supposed to have surrendered with his men years ago. What followed would haunt Elias for the rest of his days. The Renegades descended upon San Gabriel like a plague of locusts, their guns blazing and torches lighting up the morning sky. They showed no mercy, gunning down men who stood in their path and setting fire to buildings with methodical precision. "This is just the beginning!" Slade's voice boomed across the town square as his men dragged terrified civilians from their homes. "Tell them who did this! Tell them the Mexicans have declared war!" Elias, outgunned and wounded in the shoulder, could only watch from behind the wreckage of the general store as San Gabriel burned. The town's small militia had been slaughtered within minutes, leaving only scattered resistance that Slade's men crushed without hesitation. 300 miles north, Captain Ambrose Kane sat on the porch of a roadside inn, nursing a bottle of whiskey that did little to quiet the ghosts that haunted him. The war had ended, but the nightmares remained. Flashes of battles fought and men lost under his command. When the blood-soaked rider nearly fell from his exhausted horse in front of the inn, Kane recognized the desperation in the man's eyes. He had seen it countless times during the war. "Renegades burned San Gabriel to the ground," the rider gasped, clutching a wound in his side. "They're heading west, claiming to be Mexican raiders, saying it's the start of a new war." Kane felt a chill race down his spine. "Who leads them?" he asked, though in his heart he already knew the answer. "Colonel Ezra Slade," the rider confirmed before collapsing. As the innkeeper rushed to help, Kane stood frozen, memories crashing over him like waves. Slade, the man whose brutality had been legendary even among enemies, whose tactics had earned him the nickname the Butcher among Union forces. The man Kane had failed to capture in the final days of the war. In the burning remains of San Gabriel, Sheriff Elias Hardin pulled himself onto his horse, determined to overcome pain. Someone had to stand against Slade and his men before they set the entire border aflame with a war built on lies. But who would stand against such brutality? What force could possibly stop a man like Ezra Slade? If you thought this was bad, wait until you see who's coming to stop them. Tell us where you're watching from. And if you've ever seen a Western tale quite like this one, stay with us. The legend is just beginning. Ambrose Kane knew there were only 2 men alive who could help him stop Slade. Neither would be eager to see him, and both had better reasons to put a bullet in him than to ride at his side. The first he found in a saloon in Tucson, slumped over a poker table. Silas Cordell, once the Confederacy's finest tracker, now gambling away what remained of his life. His gray coat was threadbare, but the sharp eyes that had once tracked Union soldiers through impossible terrain hadn't dulled. "I need your help," Kane said, standing across from him. Silas looked up slowly, recognition darkening his weathered face. "You've got some nerve asking me for anything, Captain. Last time I saw you, you were burning my family's farm to the ground." "That was war," Kane replied. "This is something worse." "Slade," Silas said, not a question but a statement. "I heard what happened at San Gabriel." Kane nodded. "He's trying to start a new war. We need to stop him." "We?" Silas laughed bitterly. "There is no we, Captain." There's also Rafael Ortega, Kane replied. The name hung in the air between them. Rafael Ortega, half Mexican, half Comanche, who had scouted for both sides during the war, bound by loyalty to neither flag but to the borderlands themselves. Silas's expression hardened. Ortega would sooner cut my throat than help me. He'll help us stop Slade. Finding Rafael proved more difficult. It took 3 days of riding into Comanche territory before the scout found them instead, appearing like a ghost on a ridge above their camp. "You bring a Confederate to my land," Rafael said, his voice carrying across the distance. "Give me one reason not to kill you both." Kane stood slowly. "Ezra Slade is burning border towns, blaming Mexicans, trying to start a war." Rafael's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his dark eyes. "Slade is your problem, Bluecoat, not mine." "He burned San Gabriel," Silas called out. "Next could be your mother's village." Rafael descended from the ridge, his movements fluid as water. Up close, the scars across his face told stories of battles none of them had witnessed. "3 enemies," Rafael said, looking between Kane and Silas. "Against Slade's army." "3 men who know how he thinks," Kane corrected. "Who knows how he fights." Rafael studied them both, contempt and calculation warring on his face. Finally, he nodded once. "I track. You kill," he said simply. "But know this, if either of you betrays me, I will feed you to the coyotes while you still breathe." San Gabriel was a graveyard when they arrived. The stench of burnt flesh mingled with smoke that still rose from charred buildings. Dogs roamed between bodies not yet buried, and survivors moved like ghosts among the ruins. Sheriff Elias Hardin met them at what remained of the church, now a makeshift hospital for the wounded. His arm was bandaged, his face hollow with grief. "Didn't expect to see you again, Captain," Elias said to Kane, then eyed his companions with suspicion. "Especially not with a Reb and a Comanche." "We're here to stop Slade," Kane replied. "Tell us everything." Elias led them to a table where a map was spread out. "They hit us at dawn, 40 men, maybe more. Well-armed, military precision. When they finished burning and killing, Slade gathered the survivors. Told us to spread the word that Mexican raiders were responsible. But why? Silas asked, studying the map. "Land," Rafael answered before Elias could speak. "Start a war. In chaos, men like Slade take what they want." Elias nodded. "He's been hitting towns on both sides of the border, telling Americans it's Mexican bandits, telling Mexicans it's American soldiers." "And the army isn't stopping him?" Kane pressed. "Armies spread thin. By the time they respond, Slade's already gone. And with tensions already high." Elias trailed off. "It wouldn't take much to spark a real war," Silas finished. Rafael moved to the map, his finger tracing the border. 3 raids here, here, and here, he pointed. Pattern. He circles back north after each raid. "He needs supplies, ammunition," Kane observed. "And he needs to sell what he steals," Silas added. "Weapons, horses, anything valuable." A young woman approached, her dress stained with blood from tending the wounded. "They took people too," she said quietly. "My sister, other young women, children." Kane's jaw tightened. "Slaves or hostages?" "Both," Rafael answered darkly. "He builds his army with each raid. More men, more weapons." "Where will he strike next?" Silas asked. Rafael studied the map, then placed his finger on a spot. "Here, Agua Verde, small village, mostly Mexican families." "How can you be sure?" Elias questioned. "Because I would choose it," Rafael replied, his eyes hard. "Isolated, valuable horses, no telegraph to call for help." Kane looked at his unlikely companions, then at Sheriff Elias. "We ride at first light. If we're fast enough, we might get ahead of him." "Just the 3 of you?" Elias asked incredulously. Silas checked his rifle with a grim smile. "3's all we need." They rode hard through terrain that tested man and horse alike. the border country revealing its harsh beauty with each passing mile. By midday, the heat had become a living thing, shimmering across the plains and baking the rocks beneath their horses' hooves. Raphael led them through paths only he could see, ancestral trails that wound through canyons and across dry creek beds. His knowledge of the land was instinctive, born from blood and experience that neither Cain nor Silas could match. "We're being watched," Raphael said as they entered a narrow pass between towering red cliffs. Cain scanned the ridgeline, seeing nothing. "Slade's men?" "No," Raphael replied without slowing. "Apaches. They will not bother us if we stay on the trail." Silas brought his horse alongside Cain's, his voice low. "You trust him to lead us right? For all we know, he's taking us into an ambush." "I trust him to hate Slade more than he hates us," Cain answered. They made camp as the sun set, in a protected hollow with a small spring. Around the fire, silence reigned until Silas finally spoke. "What happened after Chancellorsville?" he asked Cain. "Heard you were court-martialed." Cain stared into the flames. "I refused an order. General wanted me to shell a field hospital, said it was full of Confederate officers. Turned out to be mostly civilians." "So they stripped you of real command," Silas nodded. "Explains why you were hunting deserters instead of fighting at the end." "And you?" Cain asked. "How did the South's best tracker end up drunk in Tucson?" Silas's laugh was hollow. "Surrendered at Appomattox with the rest. Came home to nothing but ashes." He took a long pull from his canteen. "Slade never surrendered, though. Just disappeared with his men." Raphael, who had been silent, suddenly stiffened. "Blood," he said, rising to his feet. "Something happened ahead." A mile further, they found the butchery, a small caravan of Mexican traders slaughtered on the trail. Bodies lay scattered, some still clutching makeshift weapons, women and children among them. "This happened yesterday," Raphael said, crouching beside one of the bodies. Silas dismounted, examining the ground. "Tracks head west, maybe 15 riders." "Slade's scouts," Cain said grimly. "No," Raphael corrected, pointing to distinctive marks in the dirt. "These men ride differently. Mexican cavalry boots, American saddles, mercenaries Slade hired." Silas knelt beside a dead man, gently closing his eyes. "We did this," he said quietly. "Slade did this," Cain countered. "Men like Slade exist because of men like us," Silas replied, his voice tight with guilt. "We taught him how to make war, then expected him to forget when it was over." Raphael watched them both with unreadable eyes. The war never ended for some. It just changed shape. As they buried the dead, a rifle shot cracked the silence. The bullet kicked up dirt at Cain's feet. "Down!" Silas shouted, diving behind a wagon as more shots followed. The ghosts of war had found them, and they wore Slade's colors. Bullets tore through the air, splintering wood and kicking up dust as Cain, Silas, and Raphael took cover behind the abandoned wagons. Gunfire echoed off the canyon walls, making it impossible to pinpoint exactly how many attackers there were. "I count 6 shooters," Silas called out, peering through a gap in the wagon wheel. His experienced eye tracked muzzle flashes from the ridgeline above. "More coming from the east," Raphael added, already knocking an arrow to his bow. He preferred it for silent killing, saving his rifle for when stealth no longer mattered. Cain checked his Colt revolver, cursing under his breath. "They've got us pinned, trying to keep us here until reinforcements arrive." A bullet whizzed past Silas's cheek, close enough to feel its heat. "Damn fine shooting for hired guns," he muttered, returning fire with his Winchester. A distant cry told him he'd found his mark. Raphael slipped away without a word, moving with the shadows as naturally as breathing. Neither Cain nor Silas noticed his absence until a scream erupted from the eastern ridge, followed by another. "They're flanking us from behind," one of the attackers shouted, panic evident in his voice. Cain seized the moment of confusion, breaking from cover to sprint to a boulder 20 yards away. 2 gunmen rose to target him, but Silas's rifle cracked twice, and both fell. The firefight intensified as the remaining attackers realized they'd lost their advantage. Raphael appeared on the ridge like a vengeful spirit, his knife glinting in the sun as he dispatched another mercenary. "One's making a run for it!" Cain shouted, spotting a rider breaking away toward the west. Silas took aim with his rifle, the stock pressed firmly against his shoulder. He tracked the fleeing rider, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rider slumped forward but remained in the saddle as his horse carried him away. "Wounded, not dead," Silas said, already moving toward their horses. The three men gave chase, following the blood trail the injured rider left behind. They found him 2 miles west, collapsed beside a stream, clutching a wound in his side. He wore the uniform of a Mexican cavalry officer, but his accent when he cursed was pure Texas. "Slade's man, sure enough," Cain said, kneeling beside the wounded mercenary. "Where's he headed next?" The man spat blood. "Go to hell, Yankee." Raphael stepped forward, his knife still stained with fresh blood. "Tell us, or die slowly." Something in Raphael's eyes convinced the mercenary that his threats weren't empty. "Verde Loma," he gasped. "Tomorrow night, Slade's bringing everyone. Going to make an example. Show the border what happens to towns that resist." Cain exchanged looks with Silas and Raphael. Verde Loma was a prosperous farming community, home to both Mexican and American families, the largest settlement for 50 miles. "How many men?" Silas demanded. "Over 60 now," the mercenary answered, life fading from his eyes. "And Slade? He's got the cannon from Fort Davis." The man's head slumped forward as he died. Cain stood, his expression grim. "Verde Loma is half a day's ride. If we push hard, we can get there before Slade." Verde Loma sprawled across a fertile valley, its whitewashed buildings gleaming in the afternoon sun. Fields of corn and wheat surrounded the town, and a church spire rose above the central plaza. It was beautiful, peaceful, and completely unprepared for what was coming. The town's mayor, Eduardo Reyes, listened grimly as Cain explained the situation. Unlike San Gabriel, Verde Loma had a sizable population, nearly 300 souls, including farmers from the surrounding countryside. "We should evacuate," Cain concluded. "Get everyone into the hills until the army can respond." Mayor Reyes shook his head firmly. "This is our home, Captain. My grandfather built this town. My father died defending it from Comanches." He nodded respectfully toward Raphael. No offense meant. "None taken," Raphael replied. "But dead men cannot rebuild towns." "If we run now, we have nothing to return to," a woman spoke up. Maria Suarez, the local school teacher, stood with her shoulders back and chin raised. "Slade will burn everything. Our homes, our crops, our church." More townspeople gathered in the plaza as word spread. Cain watched their faces, determined, afraid, but resolute. "Then we fight," Silas said, stepping forward. "We've got less than a day. If every able-bodied person helps, we can prepare." Cain surveyed the town with a military eye. "We'll need barricades on these streets, firing positions in the bell tower and upper floors of the buildings, women and children in the root cellars." The townspeople dispersed quickly, carrying out orders with surprising efficiency. Wagons were overturned to create barriers. Windows were boarded up, leaving only narrow shooting ports. The blacksmith began forging makeshift weapons for those without guns. Raphael rode out to lay traps along the approaches to town. Hidden pits, tripwires connected to shotguns, anything to slow Slade's advance or reduce his numbers. Silas found himself in the church courtyard, surrounded by farmers and shopkeepers who'd never fired a weapon in anger. "Aim for the center of the man," he instructed, setting up bottles on a wall. "Don't try to be fancy. And remember, most men will miss their first shot in battle. Take your time, even when you're scared." Cain worked with others to create a fallback position around the church, moving supplies and ammunition where they would be accessible during the fight. As dusk approached, Maria Suarez brought coffee to where Cain stood, studying his makeshift defenses. "Will it be enough?" she asked quietly. Kane couldn't bring himself to lie. No, but it might buy time for help to arrive. There's no help coming, is there? No, Kane admitted. But sometimes, Ms. Suarez, it's not about winning. It's about showing men like Slade that not everything breaks when he pushes. As night fell, Silas climbed to the bell tower with his rifle. Below, he could see Raphael returning from setting his traps, while Kane made final adjustments to the barricades. 3 enemies turned reluctant allies, preparing to make a stand with townspeople who refused to bow. In the distance, a faint cloud of dust marked the horizon. Slade was coming. Dawn broke with an unearthly stillness. Birds had gone silent, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. From his position in the church bell tower, Silas spotted them first, a dark line of riders emerging from the morning mist, their approach deliberate and unhurried. "They're coming!" he called down to the plaza. "At least 50 men, column formation." Throughout Verde Loma, civilians and defenders took their positions. Children and the elderly huddled in root cellars while women loaded spare weapons and prepared bandages. Farmers and shopkeepers nervously clutched rifles behind barricades, their faces pale but determined. Kane moved among them, his voice steady. "Wait for my signal. Aim carefully. Make every shot count." Raphael crouched on a rooftop, bow and rifle beside him. He had spent the night laying traps and now watched with predatory stillness as Slade's men approached the first line of hidden dangers. The explosion when the lead riders hit the buried powder kegs shattered the morning quiet. Horses screamed, men flew through the air, and confusion rippled through Slade's ranks. 3 more riders went down as they triggered Raphael's tripwires, shotgun blasts tearing through them. "That's the signal!" Kane shouted. "Fire!" The first volley from the town's defenders cut down a dozen of Slade's men. The renegades scattered, seeking cover as return fire crackled through the air. Lead smashed into adobe walls and splintered wooden barricades. From his vantage point, Silas methodically picked off Slade's officers, his rifle cracking with deadly precision. One by one, the men directing the attack fell, until Slade himself pulled back to a safe distance, rage contorting his features. "Bring up the cannon!" Slade bellowed, his voice carrying across the battlefield. A terrible rumbling heralded the arrival of the field gun, pulled by 4 horses and surrounded by Slade's elite guards. The defenders watched in horror as the cannon was positioned, its dark muzzle aimed at the church tower where Silas had made his stand. "Move!" Kane shouted up to him, but his voice was lost in the chaos. The cannon's roar shook the ground. Stone and wood exploded as the shell struck the tower, sending it crumbling down in a cloud of dust and debris. "Silas!" Kane cried, running toward the ruined church. Raphael seized the moment of confusion, loosing arrows into the cannon crew with lethal accuracy. In seconds, 4 men lay dead beside the field gun, but more rushed to replace them. A second shell whistled overhead, exploding in the town plaza. Screams filled the air as defenders were thrown like rag dolls by the blast. Kane found Silas half buried in rubble, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, but still alive. Together they staggered toward a new position as Slade's men charged the eastern barricade. "They're breaking through!" someone shouted. The battle descended into desperate close-quarters fighting. Raphael leapt from rooftop to rooftop, firing and retreating, leading groups of renegades into prepared kill zones where townspeople waited with shotguns. By midday, the plaza had changed hands 3 times. Bodies carpeted the ground, blood soaking into the dusty earth. Verde Loma was burning, but still it stood, and still its people fought. Kane, bleeding from a bullet graze on his arm, reloaded his revolver with grim determination. The hardest part was yet to come. The tide of battle shifted with the afternoon sun. Slade's forces, expecting an easy victory, instead found themselves mired in a grinding nightmare. Every street had become a killing field, every building a fortress. Their numerical advantage meant little in the narrow confines of Verde Loma's streets. Kane rallied a group of defenders at the burning general store, organizing a counterattack that drove back Slade's men from the critical eastern approach. Bloodied and exhausted, townspeople who'd never seen combat fought with desperate courage alongside the 3 veteran scouts. "They're pulling back to regroup," Kane shouted, spotting a withdrawal movement among the attackers. Raphael appeared at his side, his clothing torn and stained with blood, some his own, most not. "Slade is moving the cannon, trying to find a clear shot at Church." The church remained the last secure stronghold where the wounded had been gathered under Maria Suarez's care. If it fell, the last organized resistance would collapse. "Where's Silas?" Kane asked, noticing the tracker's absence. Raphael's expression darkened. "He went hunting." Silas had indeed gone hunting, for Slade himself. Moving through burned-out buildings and debris, he tracked the Confederate colonel with single-minded focus. The wound on his head had stopped bleeding, but pain throbbed with each heartbeat, fueling his determination. He found Slade directing the repositioning of the cannon, surrounded by his remaining lieutenants. From 70 yards away, Silas raised his rifle, centering the sights on Slade's chest. His finger tightened on the trigger, then relaxed. No, not like this. Not from the shadows. "Slade!" Silas called out, stepping into view. "Remember me?" The colonel turned, disbelief washing over his scarred face. "Cordell, I thought you died at Gettysburg." "Almost did," Silas replied, moving closer. "Just like you're about to." Slade's hand dropped to his holster. "You always were too honorable for your own good. Should have taken the shot when you had it." "Maybe," Silas acknowledged, "but some things need to be settled face to face." "Like old times, then," Slade smiled, a terribly empty thing. They drew nearly simultaneously. 2 shots cracked across the plaza. Slade staggered, blood blossoming across his chest. Silas felt fire tear through his shoulder, but remained standing. Slade's men froze, watching their invincible leader falter. In that moment of shock, Kane and Raphael led a charge from multiple directions. Townspeople poured from their defensive positions, overwhelming the disorganized renegades. Slade fell to his knees, gun slipping from nerveless fingers. "You've won nothing," he gasped. "The war never ended. You just stopped fighting." Silas stepped closer, looking down at the dying man. "No, we just found something better to fight for." With Slade's fall, the remaining renegades surrendered or fled. By sunset, Verde Loma had been secured, battered, burning, but unbroken. Kane found Silas sitting against a wall, allowing a townsman to bandage his shoulder. "It's over?" Silas asked. Kane nodded. "It's over." But Raphael, checking the dead, looked up with concern. "Colonel's lieutenant is missing, the one they call the Butcher." The dead lay in rows in the town plaza, covered with blankets as the evening breeze carried away the acrid smell of gunpowder. Verde Loma's survivors moved among them, searching for friends and family members. The toll had been heavy, 23 townspeople dead, dozens more wounded. Slade's body had been placed apart from the others, his once imposing frame now just another casualty of the war that refused to end. Kane, Silas, and Raphael stood over him, their expressions solemn. "What do we do with him?" Kane asked, his voice hoarse from shouting commands during the battle. "Bury him deep," Raphael suggested, "with a stake through his heart." Silas shook his head. "String him up. Show everyone what happens to men who bring war to peaceful towns." Their debate was interrupted by Mayor Reyes, who approached with Maria Suarez at his side. Both bore the signs of battle, exhaustion etched into their faces, clothes stained with blood and soot. "The prisoners are secured in the livery stable," Reyes informed them. 15 men in total. The rest either died or escaped. "The Butcher among them?" Kane asked. Maria shook her head. "No sign of him. Some of the prisoners say he fled south with a small group when Slade fell." Silas cursed under his breath. The Butcher, Lieutenant James Rawlins, had been Slade's enforcer, responsible for some of the worst atrocities attributed to the renegade force. "What should we do with the prisoners?" Reyes asked, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before the battle. "Hang them!" a voice called from the gathering crowd. "They showed no mercy to San Gabriel." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the townspeople. Many carried weapons, and the look in their eyes spoke of vengeance, not justice. "No," Kane said firmly. "We send them to the territorial authorities. Let them stand trial." "Trial?" A man stepped forward, grief and rage etched into his weathered face. "My wife died when their cannon hit our home. What justice will a trial bring her?" Silas looked at the man, then at the angry crowd. "I understand your pain," he said quietly. "But if we hang them now, we're no better than Slade." "The difference," Raphael interjected, "is that Slade killed innocents. These men chose to follow him." The tension in the plaza thickened. Kane recognized the dangerous momentum building. He had seen it during the war, when civilians caught soldiers from the opposing side. "Mayor," he said, turning to Reyes, "these men are prisoners, your prisoners. What kind of town will Verde Loma be after today? One that executes unarmed men, or one that upholds the law even after suffering?" Reyes seemed to age years in that moment, the weight of the decision visible in his slumped shoulders. Finally, he straightened. "We will hold them until the army arrives," he declared. "This town will rebuild with justice as its foundation, not vengeance." Not everyone agreed with the decision, but the crowd slowly dispersed. As night fell, the three scouts took turns standing guard over the prisoners, knowing the battle for Verde Loma's soul wasn't fully won. Then came the shots. 3 quick reports from the direction of the livery stable. Kane reached the livery stable first, Colt drawn and ready. In the lantern light, he found 2 townsmen down, one dead, one clutching a wound in his leg. The stable doors hung open, broken from their hinges. "Prisoners?" Kane demanded. "Gone," the wounded man gasped. "The butcher. He came back, had men with him." Silas and Raphael arrived moments later, followed by armed townspeople roused by the gunfire. "They can't have gotten far," Silas said, already checking for tracks in the dirt outside the stable. Raphael knelt beside him. 6 horses, heavy riders, heading west." The townspeople gathered, their faces hardening with resolve. Mayor Reyes pushed through the crowd, a shotgun clutched in his hands. "We go after them," he declared. "All of us." Kane shook his head. "No, you've lost enough people today. This is our fight now." "This became our fight when they attacked our town," Maria Suarez countered, a rifle slung over her shoulder. She had removed her blood-stained apron, but the determination in her eyes remained unchanged. "The butcher will expect pursuit," Raphael warned. "He will set up ambushes." "Then we'll need someone who can spot them," Kane replied, looking pointedly at the Comanche scout. For a moment, tension hung in the air between the 3 men. Then Silas checked his ammunition and nodded. "One last ride," he said quietly. They set out before dawn, following tracks that led into rough country west of town. Raphael rode point, reading signs invisible to the others. Silas and Kane flanked him, scanning ridge lines for possible ambush positions. They found the first trap 3 miles out, a narrow canyon where gunmen waited on both ridges. Raphael spotted them by the faintest movement of shadow against stone. "2 shooters, North Ridge," he murmured. 3 on the south." Kane and Silas exchanged glances, then silent nods. They split up, each taking one ridge while Raphael continued forward, as if unaware, drawing the ambushers' attention. When the shooting started, it was brief and devastating. Kane and Silas struck from behind, catching the gunmen in a crossfire. Within seconds, all 5 lay dead or dying. One survivor, bleeding from a chest wound, glared up at Kane. "The butcher! Knew you'd come," he gasped. "Told us to slow you down." "Where is he headed?" Kane demanded. The man's laugh turned into a bloody cough. "Back east, to finish what Slade started. Said if he can't have the border, no one will." The meaning was clear. Rawlins was heading back toward Verde Loma, circling around their pursuit to strike at the vulnerable town. "We've been played," Silas realized, already turning his horse. They rode harder than before, pushing their mounts to the breaking point. As they crested the final ridge overlooking Verde Loma, they saw smoke rising, not from the town but from the valley approach. Below, a fierce firefight raged. The townspeople, led by Mayor Reyes and Maria, had set up their own ambush halfway to town, catching Rollins and his men in a deadly crossfire. "Looks like they didn't need us after all," Silas remarked, a note of respect in his voice. Kane smiled grimly. "Let's make sure they finish the job." They spurred their horses down the slope, joining the battle for one final reckoning. A week after the battle, Verde Loma began to heal. Scaffolding rose against damaged buildings, and fresh lumber replaced charred beams. The graves had been dug, the tears shed, and now came the harder task of moving forward. The butcher, Lieutenant James Rollins, lay buried in an unmarked grave outside town. Unlike Slade, he had not died with defiant words on his lips, but screaming for mercy that never came. Justice, in the end, had been delivered not by lawmen, but by those he had sought to terrorize. Kane stood on the repaired porch of the town hall, watching the morning bustle in the plaza. Children played in the shadow of the damaged church steeple, their laughter a testament to resilience that moved him more than he cared to admit. "You're leaving," Maria Suarez stated, not a question as she joined him. Kane nodded. "Army patrol arrived last night. They'll stay until things are settled." "And your friends?" "Already gone," Kane replied. "Raphael left before dawn. Silas rode out an hour ago." She studied his face. "You three were enemies once." "Still are, in some ways," Kane admitted. "But we found something worth setting that aside for." "Will you ever see them again?" Kane smiled faintly. "Hopefully not. If we meet, it probably means something's gone terribly wrong somewhere." His horse was saddled and waiting. Mayor Reyes approached, extending his hand. "Verde Loma will remember what you did," Reyes said solemnly. "All three of you." Kane accepted the handshake. "Remember what you did. We just helped." As Kane rode east, he thought about his unlikely companions. Raphael had returned to his people, carrying warnings about the changing world beyond their territory. Silas had mentioned something about Texas, perhaps seeking the peace he'd never found after the war. The shared experience had not made them friends. Too much blood and history stood between them for that. But it had created something else, a grudging respect, an understanding that transcended the uniforms they once wore. For himself, Kane wasn't sure what lay ahead. The war had ended years ago on paper, but its echoes continued to shape the land and its people. Perhaps that was his place now, riding the boundaries, watching for men like Slade, who refused to accept that the fighting was over. The legend of how three enemies united to save the borderlands would grow with each telling. In cantinas and around campfires, people would whisper the names of Kane, Silas, and Raphael with a mixture of awe and gratitude. But the three men themselves would never speak of it again. Some battles were meant to be fought, then left behind on the long, dusty road ahead. If you thought this was epic, wait until you see what we've got next. You won't want to miss it.